Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson from Unit 3 about American federalism is Lesson 6, dealing with reserved power. In this lesson, you'll learn about expressed powers, about amendment suggestions made by the states, about the 10th Amendment, and about reserved powers. Now, in this lesson and several previous ones, we've been building a model of American federalism. At the end of the last lesson, this model included the delegation of national powers, which were enumerated powers given to the national government. Those enumerated powers given to the national government were powers that had been previously possessed by the states, and then plucked out of the state's police powers and given to the national government by the people, who are the ultimate sovereign. But even those police powers belonging to the states did not entirely encompass all the powers that people originally had in the state of nature. The people kept some of those powers back, retained them for themselves, and we call those rights. So this model shows, from all those powers that people had individually possessed in the state of nature, they kept a few for themselves as their rights. They turned over a big chunk of them to the states, the police power to take care of their health, safety, welfare, and morals. And then they plucked a few of those powers from the state and gave them to the national government, which they enumerated in the Constitution. Now, as we built this model in a previous lesson, we saw this quote from Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, from a speech he gave during the New York Ratifying Convention when the state of New York was considering whether or not to accept the new Constitution. Hamilton, arguing in favor of the new Constitution, wanted to calm the fear of some of the delegates of the New York Convention that this new Constitution would create a government that would take all the power away from the states. So he pointed out that any power not given to what he calls the federal head here, in other words, this new national government that they are creating, would be reserved, or in other words, kept by the members, in other words, by the states. He pointed out that the power had already been given to the states, been delegated to them as the police power, and that it couldn't be taken away from them and given to someone else, in this case the national government, except by an express act. In other words, very explicitly, by well understood word of the people. That's the only way it could be taken away from one government and given to another. And if it was not clearly expressly taken away and given to another, then the government that originally had it, the states, could assume that they still did have it. Well, where exactly is this redistribution of power expressly mentioned? Where are the powers given to the national government? We've actually seen this before in a previous lesson. This delegation of expressed powers is found in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, where it lists the powers that Congress has. Now, you may recall that we talked about how giving power to Congress to make certain kind of laws then also defines the boundaries of power of the president, because he can only execute laws created by Congress. And it defines the powers of the courts, too, because they can only judge whether you've obeyed powers that are created by Congress. So limiting what Congress can make laws about effectively limits the powers of the entire national government. That list of powers in Article 1, Section 8 is small enough that it can be included on this single slide. Now, that may look like a fairly long list when you first glance at it until you think about all the many, many, many things that a government could do, from setting speed limits to deciding whether or not you pay a deposit when you get a bottle of a soft drink, kind of things that we've discussed in previous lessons, to deciding licenses for hairdressers, to deciding what kind of fishing license you can get, etc., etc. There are so many things that a government does that if you stop to think about it, government actually regulates thousands of things in our lives potentially. And of those thousands of things that it potentially could regulate, only a small number of them are on this list of powers that were expressly given to the national government in Article 1, Section 8. Yet despite this small list of powers given, there were still people at the time of the founding of the United States of America that were concerned that too much had been given. Here you have Patrick Henry, one of the great patriots of the American Revolution, worrying that this delegation of power to this new national government was so much that there'd be nothing left for the people to defend their rights with. And because of worries like this from people like Henry, you had some people organize against the United States Constitution to try to prevent its ratification. They became known as Anti-Federalists, as we explained in a previous lesson. And one of their big demands was that a Bill of Rights be included with the Constitution. The reason they wanted a Bill of Rights is that it would be a list of things that the government would not be allowed to do. Well, this notion of a Bill of Rights was important enough, and this idea that it would limit the powers of the national government, that after the Constitution was ratified, a Bill of Rights was in fact added to the Constitution. But what exactly would be included in this Bill of Rights was a matter of open question. But there are plenty of suggestions. Each state, as it set about ratifying the Constitution, ended up making a list of suggested amendments or changes to the United States Constitution that they wanted to see. And it was from these suggestions made by the states that James Madison, then a member of Congress, condensed down to a list of potential amendments that were then sent out to the states that then could be ratified by them, which became the Bill of Rights that was added to the Constitution to specifically limit the power of the national government. Well, if you look through these lists of suggestions made by the states when they were ratifying the Constitution, these lists of suggestions for what should be included in a Bill of Rights, there is one type of amendment that was suggested by every single state. We can see one example of this in this suggestion from the state of Massachusetts. Now notice here in this quote, they say, okay, we're going to give some suggestions for amendments and alterations. And then the very first one they mention is that they want it explicitly declared that all powers not expressly given to the new national government under the Constitution are reserved or kept or retained by the several states for them to exercise. They want it absolutely clear that any powers not clearly, expressly delegated to this new government that was being created remained back where they'd originally been given by we the people in the states. Because this particular amendment was suggested by every single state, it ended up being one of the amendments added to the Constitution as part of the Bill of Rights. It, in fact, is the 10th Amendment, which says, just as Massachusetts suggested, any powers not given to the national government are reserved to the states or to the people. If you think back on our diagram, they would remain in those white areas, the white area of state power, or in that gray ring around, the rights retained by the people. If it had not been given to the national government, it had to remain with one or the other. So, reserved powers, then, are powers that belong to the states and were retained by them. Remember, that word reserved is a word actually used in the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to this national government are reserved to the states or the people. So if you reserve something, the thing is already there, and now you're just keeping it there. So these are powers that the states have that they then retained. So any powers not delegated to the national government are retained or reserved where they were before. So if it was a right the people have, but it's not delegated to the national government, it's a right the people still have. If it's a power that people had delegated to the states, and then it was not reassigned to the national government, then it remained reserved or retained by the states. So what this means for our diagram then, that we've been building to describe federalism in the United States of America, is that this delegation of national powers, this enumeration of powers for the national government, is effectively built with a wall around it, what we can call the 10th Amendment wall. It's saying that any powers that were not given to that national government, not in that small gray circle, do not belong to the national government. They were retained or reserved to the state that had previously had them, or to the people. What this then means is, if the national government steps beyond the boundaries of the powers that were enumerated, delegated to it in the Constitution, it is in fact usurping or illegitimately taking power from the states. It is stealing power that was supposedly, according to the 10th Amendment, retained or reserved by the states. And in stealing that power from the states, it's disregarding the sovereign act of the American people, who, acting through their state conventions when they ratified the Constitution, had decided to give certain powers to the national government while keeping others in their state governments. If the national government then on its own decides to step beyond those boundaries the people had set, it is acting illegitimately, as though it is sovereign and can boss the people around, rather than the sovereign people boss it around and tell it what its powers are or are not. So now, let's review what we learned in this lesson. Where are expressed national powers found? Are they found in the 10th Amendment? In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution? In the Constitution's Supremacy Clause? Or are they found in the Bill of Rights? Of course, they're in Article 1, Section 8, where the powers of the national government are enumerated. What kind of amendment did every single state suggest to be added to the Bill of Rights? Was it freedom of speech? No cruel punishments? The right to bear arms? Or was it that powers not delegated to the national government are retained by the states? The correct answer is every state suggested that an explicit mention be in the Constitution that any powers not given to the national government are retained by the states. What does the 10th Amendment protect? Does it protect enumerated powers, reserved powers, delegated powers, or expressed powers? It protects reserved powers, those powers retained by the states or by the people that had not been turned over and delegated to the national government. Finally, what are reserved powers? Are they powers not retained? Powers not delegated? Powers not enumerated? Or powers not defined? Reserved powers are powers that are not delegated. They have not been given away to someone else. Therefore, they remain reserved or retained by whoever had them to begin with. Okay, that's it for this lesson 6 about reserved powers. Next, in Unit 3, we'll have lesson 7 about Madison's solution to the problem of who has power.